Fight smart, harm few, score big. This was the motto of Samuel Bellamy, a man known as the Prince of Pirates, the Romantic Pirate, and the Robin Hood of the sea. He commanded fleets of ships, hundreds of men, and amassed a tremendous fortune, and is regarded as the richest pirate in history. From humble beginnings, Bellamy sought a life of adventure, excitement, and most of all, riches. Samuel Black Sam Bellamy, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Thank you so much for listening. When we think of pirates, we typically envision grand sailing ships, a skull and crossbones flag, and a surly, rowdy crew. In fact, this isn't far from the truth. Men who found themselves on pirate ships were often the most desperate of the desperate. Some were rebelling against an unjust world that hadn't given them a fair chance. Pirates tended to be a very diverse group: former slaves, political exiles, debtors, escaped convicts, and others who wanted to flee from society often found themselves on a pirate ship. There was a sense of equality, brotherhood, and even democracy aboard most pirate ships, unlike the vast economic disparity, oppression, and class distinctions found in regular society at the time. Others were tricked or forced into service, but they were all focused on one thing: acquiring valuables and money. It wasn't an easy life. Sailing ships were dirty, cramped, and infested with vermin. The work was grueling. Food and fresh water scant, and often tainted with filth and disease. Sleeping on a sailing ship after a long, hard day was no easier. In calm seas, it was hard enough. In rough seas, it became almost impossible. Their job of looting and pillaging merchant ships and naval ships came with its own dangers, of course. They were hunted by warships as the scourge of the oceans, always trying to stay one step ahead of authorities. Capture meant death, and they knew it. But still, many of these men, and indeed the occasional woman, would rather live free as a pirate than be a servant in an unforgiving world. The history of pirates during the golden age of piracy is often unclear, as they were not exactly focused on keeping detailed records. If anything, they avoided any kind of written records, and it's fair to say many of the men on pirate ships could not read or write anyway. But what we do have are extraordinary tales of looting, pillaging, and much worse. Records of Samuel Bellamy's childhood are predictably scarce and imprecise, but it is believed he was born on or around the 18th of March, 1689. His parents were Stephen and Elizabeth Bellamy. Some evidence suggests his mother died in childbirth, or perhaps shortly thereafter. The youngest of 6 children, Samuel was destined to spend his life in poverty, working on his family's tenant farm, just barely avoiding starvation. There was little to keep Samuel at home. Life was hard on the farm, and there were little prospects of a happy future. Bellamy left home at a young age, maybe as young as 12 years, although it is impossible to be certain. He most likely made his way to a port town, such as Plymouth, Bristol, Portsmouth, or even London, in search of better fortunes and adventure. The War of Spanish Succession had erupted in 1701, which is referred to as the First World War of modern times. It was triggered when the childless King Charles II of Spain, of the Habsburg dynasty, died, and left the monarchy to Philip, the Duke of Anjou, and grandson of King Louis XIV of France. King Louis proclaimed Philip the new king of Spain, and France and Spain would be united together. Other European kingdoms such as Great Britain, Holland, Prussia, and Austria saw this as an alliance that would disrupt the power balance of the region. They sought to put Archduke Charles of Austria, also a Habsburg, on the Spanish throne. This conflict spilled over to the New World as well, referred to as Queen Anne's War, as the colonies of Great Britain, France, and Spain all attempted to get control of North American territory, with native tribal peoples often fighting alongside them. Young Samuel, milling about in port towns, certainly would have heard sailors telling glorious tales of sea battles, adventures, and exploration. As young boys do, he pictured himself on the high seas earning his own fame. At the age of 13, Bellamy found himself on a ship with the Royal Navy. Samuel may have been a victim of the press gangs that scooped up young boys to work on the ships, or perhaps he joined willingly. Press gangs often lured young boys with false promises or otherwise tricked them to sign up. Other times, they would simply kidnap the boys and force them into service. He would gain valuable sailing experience and quite likely even participated in battles during the war. But Samuel was not earning much. Sailors during this time were often cheated out of their pay or given bogus IOUs as a form of payment. Looking for a better situation, Bellamy made his way across the Atlantic, landing in Cape Cod in the British colony of Massachusetts. In 1715, at age 26, he met 15-year-old Maria Hallett. The details of Maria are a bit vague. She was described as a young, beautiful blonde teenage girl. Her name might have been Mary, and she was known as Goody Hallett. Boston area native, amateur historian, and Whydah Gally enthusiast Rob Skahan.
We don't know if her name was even Maria. More than likely, it may not have. There's evidence to the contrary that it wouldn't have been because of the religious aspects of the area at the time. But it was stated that she was about 15 years old. He was 26. He had come to Cape Cod after the War of Spanish Succession, and he came on shore here. Yeah, there's a theory that he came here because he might have had extended family here. Upon their arrival, the out-of-work sailors were not warmly greeted because they were thought of to bring into the smaller communities a lot of riffraff, violence, and agricultural towns were just being these guys that were out of work, guys that were pretty tough showing up and making noise. But she was known that she was outspoken, which was unusual for a young lady at that time. It was the decorum, I believe, was supposed to be more seen and not heard. And she didn't like it. She didn't operate that way. She had her own personality. It was very strong. The story was that she met Sam Bellamy one day. This could be very much a tale, but she was singing under an apple tree or something along those lines. And he happened along and heard her voice and saw her, thought she was the most beautiful thing in the world. And they began a relationship, and her family was familiar with him. And from all accounts, from what I gathered, they actually, even though they forbid them to marry, they really didn't hate Sam Bellamy, but he just wasn't up to par to marry this girl because he was poor and he would never been able to make a home for her, etc. She continued on the relationship with him. I guess he became despondent, and her probably both, because the family forbid them to marry. And he made a promise to her that he was going to go and retrieve as a treasure hunter. There were 7 Spanish ships that went down off the coast of Florida, and he was going to try to retrieve some of the treasure of that, hopefully enough to come back and make a life for her, and they could continue on and be married. They made that promise to one another that he would return for her.
When Maria became pregnant, Bellamy struck out on his own with his close friend, Palsgrave Williams. A hurricane had recently wrecked the Spanish treasure fleet in Florida, and there was loot to be had. Upon reaching Florida, Bellamy and Williams found no treasure. The wrecked Spanish fleet had already been plundered and picked over by other treasure seekers. Frustrated and not wanting to return empty-handed, the pair joined with the infamous privateer, Captain Benjamin Hornigold, on board the Mary Ann. It was here where Bellamy learned the tricks of the piracy trade, possibly even crossing paths with Edward Teach, aka Blackbeard. Bellamy was popular among the other crew. When Hornigold announced they would no longer capture or raid British ships, a mutiny broke out. Bellamy gave the men a choice: return home penniless, or raise the black flag and join his band of pirates. The 50 or so on board elected him as their leader, and they hoisted the black flag. The farmer's son, Samuel Bellamy, was no more. Black Sam Bellamy was born. Bellamy was a striking figure. He often wore a long velvet coat, silk stockings, and buckled shoes. Unlike many other men of the time, he did not wear a powdered wig, choosing to show off his long black hair tied with a satin bow. His crew came to call him the Robin Hood of the seas because he stole from the rich and shared the loot generously with his men. Soon after taking command of the Marianne, Bellamy and his crew captured the Sultana Galley, which became Bellamy's new flagship. Just to clarify, this is not the SS Sultana, which exploded on the Mississippi River in 1865. More on that story in episodes 1 and 2 of this podcast. Palsgrave Williams was made captain of the Marianne. Wasting no time, Bellamy and Williams began raiding merchant vessels around the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. In February of 1717, after a 3-day chase around the southern Atlantic Ocean, Bellamy captured the Whydah Gally, a slave ship.
They were coming through, I believe, the Windward Passage, and they were in a ship called the Sultana. And it was a little bit smaller version, if you would, of the Whydah. Wasn't quite as good, but it wasn't a bad ship. They spotted the Whydah Galley. They stalked it, which is common for pirates. They would, pirates weren't dumb. They would move in cautiously, often stealing flags from other ships and displaying those flags, hoping to get up close enough and fool the people and these types of things. And unfortunately, the reason why they probably, in my opinion, didn't get it as quick as they did is it was a rock star himself was piloting that ship, the Whydah. And that was Captain Lawrence Prince, who was the first mate to Henry Morgan. And we all know about Henry Morgan if you ever had a glass of rum. So Lawrence Prince, he attempted a retreat. It went on for 3 days. He fired one single shot from the cannon at the Whydah and then stopped. And the Whydah got up on it. There's little to no resistance whatsoever. In fact, it said there was no resistance. It was that one shot. They get on board, and Sam Bellamy comes over, and we didn't know that we had a rock star in our midst yet. So what they did was a peaceful exchange, and then gave him the Sultana to head back. He abhorred violence. He didn't want to use violence. He was less apt to use it than other pirates. I don't think that he wouldn't. In fact, there's been at least 2 documented skirmishes, I believe, where people did resist, and I don't think it went well for them. But equally said, I believe that this is me, but I believe that Lawrence Prince, because of his reputation and who he was, that had a lot to do with how he got some of that treasure and whatnot as well, because they was like, I'm not attacking this guy. This guy's an idol out here. You know what I mean? Like, we can't believe we found him. After the 3 days, they seize the ship. They go on board and they meet Lawrence Prince. They do a fair exchange. At that time, Sam Bellamy was brought to his attention of what the ship had on board, but also what was some of the remainder of what was on board. And there were some remaining slaves. And as I understand it, he was sickened by what he saw. He brought the slaves up on board the ship, and he gave them 3 options. He said, you can go on to your destiny with Captain Lawrence Prince, meaning you're going to be a slave, whatever they're going to do with you. You can remain with us, and we'll drop you off at the first safe port of harbor. Not the first safe port of harbor for you, but for us. In that day and age, if you were a black person released, you probably literally been recaptured anyways and just sold back into slavery by somebody else. So that wasn't really. And the third option he had was you can remain on board the ship and have equal say and equal pay in all matters. I don't think that's a hard stretch imagination for people to figure out where they probably wanted to go. They were treated as good as anybody else. I mean, the pirate life was very tough, but everybody was equal on board the ship. To the point, it's been said that if Sam Bellamy made a statement that if we don't have enough hammocks for everybody, we don't use hammocks for anybody. A little bit more even than 1/3 of all the pirates in the Caribbean were freed slaves, emancipated slaves by the pirate ships. Not a lot of people know that, but there were a ton of black pirates. They were very common because where else were they going to go?
The Whydah had just traded 500 enslaved Africans in Jamaica and was loaded with sugar, indigo, silver, and gold. The Whydah was named after the West African port of Whydah, an important stop in the triangular trade. Merchant ships from Europe traded textiles, weapons, and manufactured goods in exchange for enslaved Africans in West Africa. The next stop was in the West Indies, where the slaves were traded or sold for rum, sugar, tobacco, and indigo, to be sold back in Europe. Bellamy took the impressive Whydah as his new flagship, which he refitted with 28 guns. Within just 1 year, Black Sam's fleet had looted over 50 ships across the Caribbean, Bahamas, and east coast of North America. With their coffers overflowing with treasure, Bellamy set sail for Massachusetts. He allegedly announced to his crew, "Lads, we've gotten enough. It's time to go home." Williams had family in Rhode Island, and Bellamy presumably wished to see Maria Hallett again. It is likely Bellamy didn't know Maria was pregnant, or the fate of his child. In April of 1717, just off Block Island in Rhode Island, Williams, on the Mary Ann, encountered a sloop of war out of Boston, commanded by a Captain Beer. Williams captured the sloop, taking Captain Beer prisoner, and placed him aboard the Whydah. But Bellamy was not a cold-blooded murderer. His standard practice was to capture ships, keep the best ones for his fleet, recruit any crew willing to join him, and allow the rest to be released safely. Bellamy wanted to allow Captain Beer to keep his ship, but he left it up to his crew to decide. The crew of the Whydah were not feeling as generous, and the ship was burned. Bellamy invited Beer to join his crew, but the captain refused, replying, "My conscience does not allow me to break through the laws of God and man." This resulted in a now famous speech, perhaps a manifesto, from Bellamy. Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, reported this speech in a non-fiction account. "I am sorry they won't let you have your sloop again, for I scorn to do anyone a mischief, when it is not to my advantage. Damn the sloop, we must sink her, and she might be of use to you. Though you are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security. For the cowardly whelps have not the courage otherwise to defend what they get by knavery. But damn ye altogether. Damn them for a pack of crafty rascals, and you who serve them for a parcel of hen-hearted numbskulls. They vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Had you not better make them one of us than sneak after these villains for employment?" Captain Beer was then subsequently marooned on a small island and left to his fate. Williams took the Mary Ann and continued to Block Island to visit his family, while Bellamy headed north toward Cape Cod, presumably bound for Eastham to visit Maria. Williams and Bellamy had made arrangements to rendezvous in Maine at a later time.
One of the things about Maine during this time is the English built settlements up in Maine, and they hated them. They didn't like them because the shores were so rocky and craggy that they didn't like to bring their ships into there. The weather wasn't very good up there. It was Maine and snowy and cold and hard. But when the war was over, they were done with their military, they pulled out and they left the buildings, essentially. So pirates would come up into that area, and they were kind of fond of it because, A, it was a tough spot to get in, even for them, but less likely the governments would come in there to pursue them. And also, they didn't have to make anything. It was kind of, a lot of it was already done. So it made a nice hiding spot.
The Whydah, while sailing to Cape Cod on April 26th, was hit by a violent nor'easter off the coast of Wellfleet, with winds thought to be as strong as 70 miles per hour. The ship ran aground, stern first, on a sandbar just 500 feet from shore, where it was battered and tossed by waves as high as 30 feet. Rumors later spread that the crew was in a drunken stupor and was in no shape to respond to the violent storm. The Whydah capsized and sank in the cold waters of the Atlantic, and at least 3 other ships of the fleet were either destroyed or damaged. All but 2 men on board the Whydah perished, including Black Sam Bellamy.
the Whydah hit a sandbar. According to Thomas Davis on his statements, he said, right up prior to midnight, somebody yelled out breakers. They could hear the ocean, essentially, breaking on the way. And that's a bad sound when you're in a big ship. So breakers, the cry went out. And supposedly this is a horrific scene, but the ship hit a sandbar at midnight. The ocean washed over the ship itself and put out all the lights on the ship. So it was completely in darkness. The only light they had was the flash of lightning above them. You got to imagine just this ocean just flowing over your ship viciously, 40-foot waves, 70-plus mile-an-hour winds. And when they hit the sandbar, it was said that there were men cast off of the rigging, smashing off of the decks and into the ocean. The winds came and carried the mainsail away, which means the wind literally dropped the mainsail of the ship, pulling it off of the sandbar out about 30 feet of water where it capsized. And when it capsized, he had all those guns underneath stored in the deck. Those started smashing through the decks, literally breaking it like balsa wood, ripping the ship in half and into segments. And then the men were being trapped underneath it and being crushed and dragged out to sea.
In time, 102 bodies were found and were buried in a mass grave on Cape Cod. A total of 8 survivors from the small fleet were captured and tried in Boston.
When they were arrested, they were caught by Thomas Doane. Him and his party came out and caught them. And they brought them to the Barnstable jail, and they held them there for a short time and then brought them down to Boston to be tried. And I believe they spent 6 months in that jail in their same clothes. They never even given fresh clothes. It's pretty apparent as you read the notes that they being in the Boston English court in Boston, they wanted to kill these guys. Word had already been released that the King of England released a pardon to pirates. However, the actual transcript with his seal hadn't made it there yet, and they pushed up their trial. They wanted to convict them and kill them before the letter made it.
6 of them were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Famed minister Cotton Mather accompanied the men across Boston Harbor to Charlestown, where they were hanged. Thomas Davis and Thomas South, both carpenters, successfully argued they were forced into piracy against their will and were found not guilty.
Thomas Davis was the young Englishman who basically was going to roll on everybody anyways. You read the trial, he was a guy that said he was forced into it, and he probably was, because there's actually notes that the pirates used to tell him to shut up and stop crying, and he was annoying to them. But at the same time, he went that night of the storm, he made it up a jetty and went to a gentleman's house and said to the guy, I know where there's treasure. Brought him to the beach. They were scoffing up some of it, and he told the guy, don't speak of it. And that guy made testimony to that during the trial. But he swore he was pressed into it and had nothing to do with it. I mean, the first place you think you'd go is, can you tell me where the sheriff's station is? I need to come forward about some things here. And he didn't. He says, before we go and do all that, let's go down and get some of this valuable stuff and not tell anybody we got it. Thomas South, interestingly enough, was also spared as a carpenter. However, I don't know if it's relevant or not, but I'll point it out. He was from Boston. So the hometown boy made it. John Julian was a Mesquite Indian. He was released as well. And he didn't even leave the courtroom. He was captured right there in the courtroom, essentially, and sold to the grandfather of John Quincy Adams as a slave. I hate to say it, but I believe through kind of systemic racism in that, they were more or less on the idea of, we're not even going to waste our time trying him. I guess he escaped several times. He wound up at one point killing a bounty hunter that went after him to bring him back to the Adams family. He killed the bounty hunter, and then he himself was later hung.
Governor of Massachusetts, Samuel Shute, ordered Captain Cyprian Southwick of the colony's naval force to search for the wreck and salvage any valuables for the crown. Southwick did not find much of value, but he reported seeing, quote, at least 200 men from several places at 20 miles distance plundering the pirate wreck of what came ashore when she turned bottom up. His report did include information and clues as to the Whyddah's location, as we shall see later. Unaware of the fate of the Whydah, Palsgrave William sailed for Maine to rendezvous with Bellamy, where he waited. After hearing the news of the Whydah and the other sloops, he sailed south, possibly searching the area of the wreck for himself. Eventually, Williams made it to the Bahamas, where he met up with Richard Noland, the captain of one of the other sloops caught in the storm. Williams, Noland, and many other pirates, including Benjamin Hornigold, accepted an offer of pardon to all pirates who surrendered before September of 1718. But Williams was a pirate at heart and was soon back at sea. By 1719, he was serving under Captain William Moody and raiding ships along the West African coast. After Moody marooned about 25 sailors for attempted mutiny, the remaining crew mutinied again, disposing of Moody. Command was bestowed on Olivier Lavasseur, and he, Williams, and the rest rejoined the marooned sailors and continued their plundering. By 1723, Williams retired from piracy and assumed a quiet life. Samuel Bellamy never made it back to Maria Hallett. It is likely Bellamy didn't know Maria was pregnant. Following Bellamy's departure, Maria's story took a dark and twisted turn.
She gave birth and was trying to take care of the baby on her own. The story has it she was in a barn with this baby, and she went off to look for food. And unfortunately, the child choked on some hay or something like that, passed away. It was found that the baby was deceased, and they arrested her, put her into jail, where she, again, being the strong-willed young lady that she was alleged to be, it was said that she would escape the jail regularly. Like literally, that jail had a hard time holding her, but she would often come back because she had nowhere to go and she was hungry. So she was eventually brought out of the jail and was exiled from the community that she was in.
Maria fled to Wellfleet, where she lived as a recluse in a small shack in the Marconi area. Locals claimed she was a witch, and Maria earned the nickname the Witch of Wellfleet. Maria lived a lonely, solitary life, waiting for her Samuel to return, or perhaps angry about his departure. Travelers were told to ride quickly past her house and keep their distance. Legends about Goody Hallett abound, some more plausible than others. One legend claims Maria was seen on a cliff overlooking the ocean the night of the wreck. Witnesses claim they saw Maria summoning the storm to kill Bellamy for abandoning her. There were some that believed Maria had retrieved the treasure of gold and silver for herself and buried it somewhere in Wellfleet. The location of the Whydah and its famed treasure remained a mystery for 267 years. It is estimated that Bellamy and his crew amassed a fortune worth about $400 million in modern currency. Survivors from the fleet claim there were 180 bags of gold on board, and other treasure. Many searched, but the Whydah seemed to be lost to the ages. Barry Clifford was born in 1945 in Cape Cod, where he grew up hearing the legends of Black Sam, the Whydah, and the lost treasure. It's a story tailor-made to pique the interest of a young boy. He was close enough to look out over the water, where the Whydah allegedly went down, and wonder about the treasure hidden under the water. By this time, many of the locals dismissed rumors of the treasure, believing it was just a fable or that the treasure had long been picked over. Clifford's Uncle Bill told him stories of the treasure, and believed it was still out there. As an adult, Clifford became a scuba diver, and had logged many hours underwater. At age 36, he decided it was time for him to fulfill his boyhood fantasy and search for the Whydah's riches. Clifford used clues from the past to guide him to a starting point. Captain Cyprian Southwick's notes and map from 1717 provided a literal treasure map for Clifford, and helped him narrow down his search to a specific area. This and other clues led him to find the Whydah Gally in 1984. Surprisingly, the Whydah was under just 14 feet of water and 5 feet of sand. In 1985, the ship's bell was found, imprinted with the words, "The Whydah Gally 1716, confirming beyond a doubt the long-lost pirate ship of Samuel Bellamy had been found. Clifford recruited 300 investors to fund his efforts to salvage the wreck and its treasure. Clifford founded the Whydah Management Company of New York in 1987. The following year, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, citing federal admiralty law, ruled that the wreck of the Whydah and all of its contents legally belonged to Barry Clifford. With legal hurdles cleared and an army of investors, Clifford got to work on the salvage efforts. Since then, he and his team have performed annual excavations of the wreck, bringing up coins, personal items, and other artifacts. Interestingly, Clifford found the fibula bone of a young boy during one of his dives. Evidence shows a 10 to 11-year-old boy named John King served on the Whydah and was the youngest of the crew. Clifford also found a black leather shoe of a size that would fit a boy of 8 to 11 years. Clifford maintains a private facility for storing the discovered artifacts, but opened the Whydah Pirate Museum, now located in West Yarmouth, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod. The museum houses thousands of items brought up from the Whydah, and is home to the largest collection of pirate artifacts recovered from a single shipwreck anywhere in the world. Visitors will even see a full-size replica of the Whydah itself.
They have the cannons that were brought up. They have the artifacts from the ship, different cannonballs down to different instruments to tell what time it was. They even have a concretion with one of the pirates' bodies in it.
With every dive season, Barry Clifford and his team uncover new discoveries from the Whydah, and the artifacts brought up help us remember the legacy of Black Sam Bellamy in the age of piracy. That's going to do it for the story of Black Sam Bellamy and the Whydah Gally. Thank you so much to Rob Skahan for joining me, and be sure to listen all the way to the end of this episode for a tiny bonus nugget. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can follow Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs at ShipwrecksPod on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and at ShipwrecksPod at c.im on Mastodon. If you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you don't use either of those apps, you can leave a review on goodpods.com or podchaser.com. It will only cost a moment of your time, and I would greatly appreciate the support. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at Sean Secret, or on the web at sean.siegfried.se. Please join me in 2 weeks for episode 1 of the story of the Batavia. It is a wild and bizarre bit of history you will not want to miss. Until next time, don't forget to wear your life jackets.
We have chickens here in my house, and we have one chicken, this little white chicken. She disappears on us every day and comes back into the coop every night, and we've named her Maria. We named our chicken Maria because she literally does just that, and we can't figure out how she's doing it.